I am honored to have been asked to give a presentation on Raphael Montañez Ortiz as part of the closing celebrations for this groundbreaking retrospective organized by el Museo del Barrio. I regret not being able to do so in person, but I am grateful for having spent a few days with Raphael earlier this week. I first met Raphael 30 years ago when I co-curated an exhibition on installation art at Cornell University's Art Museum. The exhibition examined installation art by way of 8 Latino artists, an unheard of approach at that time, and perhaps still now. How can Latinos be the measure of a global artistic medium like painting, sculpture, installation, performance, and so on? Subsequent physical violence against the artwork in the exhibition led a coalition of mostly Latino students to take over the president's building, demanding that the university hire more Latino faculty, increase library holdings on Latino culture and Latin American culture, and invest resources in student support. They knew that this violence against Latino art reflected institutional neglect. Raphael was there at the center of this moment. The first night that the students occupied the building, he joined them, organizing a videotaped trial of the university as a way for the students to formalize their complaints, give evidence from their personal experiences, and develop a set of related demands. They were threatened with expulsion, but eventually succeeded in getting their demands met. In this moment, Raphael moved effortlessly between his destructivist art practice, his role as a teacher, and his uncanny ability to help effect institutional change. Over the last 30 years, our friendship has certainly changed my life too, as a scholar, as a teacher, and as a person. He's also changed my understanding of history, from the Enlightenment notion of progress to something much messier, and that often is best told by going backwards. In my presentation today, I will make no attempt at an overview, nor will I do a deep dive into a single work of art. Each of these require substantially more time to fully grasp the range of Raphael's work. Instead, I offer some musings on Raphael's art as it relates to the idea of a museum. I start with this slide of an action by the Art Workers Coalition in 1970. The tall man on the right is artist Raphael Ortiz, as he was known at the time. Ralph was born in 1934, and since 1957, his artistic practice has centered on destruction. He explains such work in his 1962 Destructivism, a Manifesto. And I read, "There are today throughout the world a handful of artists working in a way which is truly unique in art history. These artists are destroyers, materialists, and sensualists, dealing with process directly. These artists are destructivists and do not pretend to play God's happy game of creation. On the contrary, theirs is a response to the pervading will to kill." This manifesto offers a global vision as a context for the artist's own work, even as his own work itself is quite particular in its form, material, and address. Ortiz's manifesto offers a global vision as a context for the artist's own work. Now in this image, you see Ortiz strangling a Museum of Modern Art board trustee, played by Jean Touche, while another privileged elite, played by John Hendricks, aims a gun at the protesters, shouting the N-word. Touche and Hendricks were members of the recently formed Guerrilla Art Action Group, which Ortiz in many ways inspired and encouraged. Now mind you, by 1970, Ortiz's work was already in the MoMA collection. MoMA director Alfred Barr actually helped Ortiz carry this work into the museum in 1963 after Richard Hulsenbeck, one of the founders of Dada, encouraged him to see Ortiz's work. This 1961 work is the first in a series Ortiz called Archaeological Finds. Unlike archaeologists, though, Ortiz did not recover fragments with the goal of reconstructing a lost object from the past. Instead, he turned household furniture into fragments removing them from their usefulness within consumer and domestic culture, and leaving behind an art object. This archaeology of the present is an approach that has since then been widely taken up by artists. Like an archaeologist, in this talk, we're going back in time as I'm telling the story, 1970 to 1962 to 1963, and then 1961. Let's go back a few more years to 1957, when Ortiz starts working on this manifesto about destruction as a basis for art. Ortiz was a student at the Pratt Institute, courtesy of the GI Bill, and he had just been temporarily expelled. So he was destroying 16mm film prints from old movies that were being distributed by Castle Films. These films could be bought at local stores for home viewing. In this moment, artists around the world were turning to the detritus of consumer culture, and that included old films that were no longer in theatrical release, but were entering the home as private objects. This is a very interesting moment because the film industry itself is not archiving itself. So that's happening in the home. Now, in art scholarship, Bruce Conner's A Movie is a key work that marks that pivot point in 1958. Conner is drawing from the same Castle films that Ortiz used. In writing about the film's impact, curator Bruce Jenkins argues that Conner would almost single-handedly redirect the materialist perspectives of late modernism onto cinema. Here, by way of the critic, we have a point of origin, a defining work, and the artist as a heroic figure. But Conner's film is actually more conventional than modernist. It follows the arc of Hollywood classical narrative supported by classical music. In this case, Ottorino Respighi's Pines of Rome in 1924, a symphonic poem allegorizing the dawn of the Roman Empire, Roman Republic, through its military and roadways. Here, colonialism, empire, and the artist, diagnostic modernism, all follow the same form. The problem and the critique both lean on the same big story about progress, just two different sides of it. The proof? Those who write about a movie treat it as a silent film, a sequence of images, that is, as a visual argument and not as an audio-visual experience grounded in affect, which is essentially what cinematic narrative is. Meanwhile, in 1958, Ortiz completes two works, newsreel and cowboy and Indian film. And I'll show brief clips from each of these.
Now you disappoint me.
In making these films, Ortiz used a tomahawk to destroy each film print, issuing a war chant while shaking the fragments in a medicine bag, then randomly pulling out pieces and splicing them together irrespective of their orientation. Ortiz was not just manipulating the moving image as a critique of Hollywood, he was intervening at a material level by destroying and transforming the artifacts of media culture that were now archived in the home, alongside other consumer appliances. Ortiz violently fractures sound, image, and narrative, releasing the rationalism, nationalism, and colonialism that are structured into narrative cinema as a commercial industrial product. I'm not trying to displace Bruce Conner so that Raphael Ortiz can be the hero of modernism's turn toward new material forms and old political critiques. Instead, I'm pointing to the concept that troubles art history, and that is the notion of a meanwhile. meanwhile confounds historical narratives based on a point of origin, a defining work, and a heroic artist. There is always a meanwhile. What if we wrote our own art histories with that sense of possibility based on planetary, genetic, and social interdependence? And that's what Ortiz has proposed over the last 8 decades. Yes, play piano, make films, and write books, but just use an axe. Which brings me to the title of my talk, Ralph Ortiz's Museum of the Future. The phrase Museum of the Future comes from Ortiz's 1965 solo exhibition, Penny Candy and Fudge Assemblages, in Provincetown, Massachusetts. The venue was Barrett's Candy Store, where Ortiz worked during summers over a 5-year period, and which was owned by his in-laws. The assemblages were installed around the candy store with descriptive text underneath. With the exception of the preview, the candy store went about business as usual during the run of the exhibition, with Ortiz making fudge and pulling taffy, not as a performance, but as a summer job to support his family and rent studio space. His candy manifesto, seen here in draft form, appears anomalous within the context of his emerging destructivist practice. It's about making non-essential and non-instrumental things that give pleasure not to the eyes, as with the visual arts, but to the mouth, wherein, as he writes, the sweet tooth leadeth to the soul. The manifesto ends with the line, "The candy store is the museum of the future." As you can see, Ortiz has crossed out the typewritten word studio and then the handwritten word church before settling on museum. If in the early 1960s, Klaus Oldenburg, Edward Kienholz, and Yayoi Kusama, among others, created artificial environments for restaging and habitation or consumption within an art space, here Ortiz turns the non-art space into the museum of the future. In the process, he also breaks down the boundary between the viewer and object by positing the aesthetic experience as visual and oral, and as symbolic and somatic. This shift in the idea of what art is, from something located in the art object and art space to one expressed through everybody's body, guided his role in the development of various new art forms. I want to jump ahead to 1969, just before the protest performance in 1970, where I started, in order to describe the fracture that was then taking place with respect to Ortiz and other racial minorities in the avant-garde. In 1969, Ortiz founded the first U.S. Latino museum, El Museo del Barrio, in New York City. But if Ortiz moved fluidly between two worlds, between an art world and a community that had been excluded from that art world, the writing of art history did not do so as well. So his own artistic production fell between two categories that became mutually exclusive in the United States after 1968. Avant-garde art, now seen as by heroic white men, and minority art, understood to be by women and non-whites. Even so, for Ortiz, El Museo del Barrio represented an infrastructure or cultural institution whose aim would be, as he said, regaining our right to exist in a larger context. Now, the museum has in many ways exemplified that going into its sixth decade. But we have to admit that it's easier to say that than to do it. Now, bringing these two worlds together is easier said than done, which explains why Ortiz uses destruction as the conceptual framework and the method for what he is proposing. In breaking the entrenched narratives for art history, it has taken decades for scholars and curators to recuperate artists like Eva Hesse, Muriel Latterman-Ukeles, and Charlotte Moorman as central to the changes taking place in the art world in the 1960s, New York and elsewhere. By the way, Ortiz went to high school with Hesse, college with Latterman-Ukeles, and collaborated extensively with Moorman. He is part of their history, just as they are part of his. but a divide remains within the larger field. So what do we do? If we were to apply destructivism to this question today, we might end up with the following statement. The museum of the future resides not in buildings and institutions, but in the bodies and bodies of work that have been kept outside. Do not accept your exclusion as the framework from which you then speak, for in doing so, you accept their argument and end up saying little more than, yes, but. No, start with meanwhile and tell a different story, one that has the audacious humility of existing in a world filled with other people and other living things. They, who now control access, are not the measure of all things, but neither are we. The artist whose works move you to take up this cause know that about art. And so do the museum guards, school children, and janitors who look like you and who are the ones filling up museums during the workdays. We are already in the world, so let's start describing it on other terms than the ones we have been handed. Now, this is a bit of speculation on my part, but in terms of the ideas that Raphael's been working with over the last 8 decades, and the very kind of incremental way in which he has developed his practice, I think that his work offers us some ideas to what's already happening, which is an effort by generations of artists, some coming into the field, some having been there for a while, to change that narrative and to shift things and to do it in a way that's not about just making a little space, but about rethinking what the whole means. And I think that that's a part of what remains extremely important in terms of his work. And I'm not talking about manifestos and making statements about how things should be. It's making work that rethinks what art is and what our relationship to art is. So I'm going to end with Raphael's current work. Since 2018, he has returned to the painterly work of placing destroyed objects on surfaces. You see an example here. Now, from about 1960 to 1962, he was using this approach as he transitioned from abstract expressionist painting to archaeological finds. And it is a very thoughtful gradation of moving from one to the other. And he did this in dialogue, both in terms of talking and sharing readings, but also in terms of what their own practices were doing with his mentor, Robert Richenberg, who was one of the original abstract expressionist artists and was teaching at Pratt at the time. And he is the one who fully supported what he was doing and what other artists like Muriel Latterman Ukeles were doing, and he paid the price. He ended up being fired for refusing to censor their work so that they could go forward and continue developing as artists. So these new works that I'm showing one example of started with, eventually became known as a series called Potlatch. And it consists of broken dollhouses, related furniture, mini pianos, toys, and other small objects. So the scale of what Raphael did using the furniture from his own home is now gone to the more symbolic one of dollhouse items that you can purchase online. And they're arranged in shallow boxes lined with colored fake fur and then covered with plexiglass. So, and they range from small boxes that are similar in scale to Joseph Carnell's box assemblages to much larger works that are 4 feet wide, maybe 4 feet wide, maybe 5 feet tall. In his earlier work, in the early 60s though, the work was symbolic in addressing the trauma of history. Whereas the more recent work, the Potlatch series, is a playful return to this turning point in his career, his formal education, and personal life. Each work is attentive to color, shape, and composition. Clearly they are constructions as much as they are destructions, and they do not represent anything other than playful objects. There is something about their arrangement that suggests the pileup of destruction following a hurricane or a man-made environmental disaster, and at the same time, they are also simply beautiful. Ortiz makes no claims to the potlatch as an indigenous ceremony on his part, other than as a way of rethinking his own relationship with destruction, property, social status, and the act of gifting. And in this regard, and what I think is very moving about this series, it's a fairly ample series that you worked on between 2018, around 2020, 2021, is that the potlatch series can be seen as his gift to his earlier self. But it is also a stepping stone to the next work, such as the piece that the New York Times identified as the standout work in this exhibition. So I'll end by saying, and I suspect he's on the stage, that was his plan, to be on the stage rather than in the audience. I'll say, Raphael, you not only created the Museum of the Future, but you have also taught us that the Museum of the Future resides in all of our bodies. Thank you.